Hi, I'm Jeff Rains, the pastor of First Baptist Church, Shreveport. I'm so glad you're listening today to the First Baptist Podcast. We worship every Sunday at 10:30 a.m. at 543 Ockley Drive in Shreveport. There is always a place for you. The key question I want us to think about today is, who do you follow? Who do you follow in life? I think that's one of the most important questions we deal with. We all follow people in one setting or another, and we may say, I'm not a follower, I'm a leader, I'm my own person, or I'm independent, but even leaders follow people in all kinds of different ways. Part of that, it's just how we learn, it's how we grow. Children, when they're little, follow their parents around and help in the kitchen or in the yard with whatever we're doing, absorbing lessons. So often we do that at work. Do you remember going into a first job and you have no idea what you're doing? Just trying to figure things out, and so often you try to find someone who's been there, someone who knows the office, someone who knows the process, knows the procedures of the school or wherever it is that you're working. My first ministry job was at Meadowbrook Baptist Church outside of Waco in Robinson, Texas, and my desk was one corner, just in the corner of the pastor's office, and so I was in there all the time. Unless he was counseling someone, obviously I left, but I was in there when he was talking to people in crisis on the phone, or when he was trying to figure out a problem, or had a difficult situation and he'd ask my advice and I'd see how he responded. It was really valuable. It wasn't a seminary course, but it was an incredible education in what it looks like to try to pastor people and lead people. We follow all kinds of people at a distance. In fact, on some of the social media platforms, if you come across someone, I'm interested in them, the literal button that you push says follow. I want to see what they produce. I want to read what they put out there. Or sometimes we talk about following, maybe a favorite news host or a show. We watch them so long that their voice just kind of becomes the voice of reliability and reason and trust, and we end up leaning on them to help explain the world to us. Or we talk about following athletes or teams. Was there any news in LSU world this week? I know many of you follow that. We may follow coaches, we may follow quarterbacks, athletes, or we may follow chefs or decorators or asset managers. There's all kinds of people out there that we can follow. Now, it's important when we're following something that we don't turn off our brains and just become uncritical and outsource all that to them. We need to be discerning. We need to retain our own judgment and weigh what it is that we're hearing. A lot of our following is, of course, mediated through technology. We don't even know the people on the other end, and maybe there's not any people on the other end today. Maybe it's just an algorithm that's leading us along. How often do you just follow your maps on your phone without even thinking about it? You set your destination and it pops up on the screen. A few years ago, a woman named Connie Monsines was on her way to pick up her husband at the Denver airport, and there was a wreck on Pena Boulevard, and so Google Maps suggested there was a detour that would cut the driving time in half. So I'm always open to shorter routes. On I-20, so often it's blocked, and so I'll wander around the back roads. So, she saw, this will cut the time in half, so she took the new suggested exit, and then it said to turn right on a dirt road, and she thought, this seems kind of strange, but other cars were doing it too, and so she turned right on the dirt road, and it had rained recently, and before long, about 100 cars got stuck in the mud on a private dirt road, all because they were just blindly following what the phone had said for getting where they were trying to go. We have to be careful with who we follow. You've heard the old phrase, you don't want to hook your cart to the wrong horse. When we follow someone, they can lead us into the mud or lead us into a real problem. The people we're following may not be telling us the truth, or they may be corrupt, or they may be wrong. So this is why the question is so important for us. Who do we follow? Who do you follow in life? In John chapter 10, what's at stake is the question of, should we follow Jesus or not? So we were in this very same chapter last week, and so we have really the same scene in the same setting. And chapter 10 is connected with chapter 9, which is where Jesus healed the man who had been born blind, and it was this amazing miracle. And so his friends take him to the religious leaders, the Pharisees, to show off this great work of God. And remember, they weren't impressed because this happened on the Sabbath. And so we have this conflict of values. On the one side, we have liberation and healing and freedom and this unique and wonderful thing that had happened in the world. And then on the other side, we have the Pharisees' rules and their dogma and their absolute certainty that their interpretation of God's rules was right. They had zero doubt in their mind and felt like they were the ones who communicated God to other people. And so when they're arguing with this man can't be from God because he healed you on the Sabbath. You shouldn't follow him because he's a sinner. That was their perspective. And remember, the blind man gave that simple, wonderful testimony to Jesus. He said, whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. But one thing I do know, I was blind and now I see. We don't have to have all the answers in life, but we can just speak a simple testimony from our lives of what Jesus has done for me. So he is able to connect some things, and he says, this is remarkable. You don't know where he came from, but he opened my eyes, and we know God doesn't listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person. Nobody has heard of the opening of the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were from God, not from God, he could do nothing. So they said, you were in sin from your birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. So they kick him out of the synagogue as a result of what God's done for him. So in chapter 10, Jesus responds. And so this is that long metaphor that he uses of sheep and the sheepfold. We talked about how he says some people try to sneak in and don't go through the door. Last week we saw Jesus teaching, I am the door for the sheep. Jesus is the way for us to salvation and to life. And Jesus gave that great contrast. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy, but I have come that they may have life and have it more abundantly. So this brings us to our next of the I am statements. There's 7 of these in the gospel. We're working through these one at a time over 7 weeks. And there are 7 in the Gospel of John, the simplest kind of statements he could construct. I am. And so I am the bread of life. I am the door. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine, and I am the light of the world. All of these, I think, are kind of echoing when Jesus uses this sentence, I am. There's a really famous passage in the Old Testament that uses that phrase. Do you remember that? It was Moses at the burning bush. And Moses is so concerned about, he really doesn't want to do what God is calling him to do. And one of his questions is, he says, if I go and tell the people that you've called me, who will I say you are? And that's where we have this great name of God given, and it's mysterious. I am who I am. And that language Jesus echoes here. And I think the Pharisees probably would have heard it too when he describes himself in these I am sentences. And these are like pieces of a puzzle, and we put these together and we get this fuller picture of who Jesus is and what he's come to do for us. So let's look at chapter 10 of John, and in verse 11. He says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. And so when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. And then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They will listen to my voice, and there will be one flock and one shepherd. And the reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and the authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. So can we rely on Jesus? Is Jesus the one we should follow? We've already seen in chapter 9, he's the one who's brought life and healing. But in this I am statement, we learn a couple of more things about Jesus and who he is. First, we have the character of the Good Shepherd is described in this passage. First off, there's this word good. What is a good shepherd? Sometimes we've heard the sentence before that good is the enemy of great. We want great. We don't want to settle for good. And sometimes good can kind of be mild praise. You turn in the research paper. Well, how was it? Well, it was good. You expect a but to come after that of how it can be better. But this word, when Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, it's not the ordinary, kind of basic minimum requirement word for good versus bad, but it's a kind of broader word that Jesus uses. Like we could translate it, I am the beautiful shepherd. I am the wise shepherd. It's a richer term than just that base level good or bad statement here. I am the good shepherd. And this echoes some of the Old Testament. So earlier this year, we spent a couple of weeks with what is probably the most famous of the Psalms in Psalm 23. Remember that great statement, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And so we talked about the provision of God in taking care of everything that we need in providing for us. He is the provider. And here Jesus is stepping into that role. That's part of the character of the Good Shepherd. Or there's a story in Ezekiel 34. We read from it earlier. The Pharisees absolutely would have known this passage well. And when Jesus starts talking about the Good Shepherd, it would have set off Ezekiel 34 alarm bells. Because Ezekiel 34 starts with this sharp word of judgment that's coming on the false shepherds of Israel. And this was talking about the people that were leading them, their leadership class, and they were corrupt, and they were abusing the sheep. They were abusive and manipulative. And so Ezekiel 34 says that God is going to come. I'm going to be your shepherd. I'm going to send a servant of David to be a shepherd for you. So when Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, there would have been a lot of echoes about this expectation that the bad shepherds are getting kicked out and that God is doing something new. I love the description of the hired hand here in verse 12. When Jesus talks about what it looks like to be a good shepherd, and then he mentions these hired hands, and they're just there for the paycheck. They're going to do the very minimum that they can do to get by. They're loafing at every opportunity. You've encountered these people before. They don't care about the customers. They don't care about the product. They don't care about the coworker. It can be so infuriating when you're stuck with the hired hand person that Jesus is describing here who just doesn't care. And the hired hand is going to run at the first sign of trouble. They're going to be out the door. But the character of the good shepherd is different. So in verse 14, it says the good shepherd, part of the character of the good shepherd is the good shepherd knows the sheep. This means he knows the ones who get tired. He knows the ones who slow down at the end of the day. He knows the ones who will absent-mindedly nibble at grass and wander away and get off into trouble. He knows the ones who are hurting or limping today. And as the Good Shepherd knows the sheep, Jesus knows all about you. Jesus knows about your hurts. Jesus knows about your weaknesses. Jesus knows about the days that are really hard for you, and that's what makes him good, that he knows the sheep. One of my favorite psalms is that incredible reflection that we find in Psalm 139. O Lord, you have searched me and you've known me. You are intimately acquainted with all my ways. You wove me together in my mother's womb. The Good Shepherd knows you. A second part of the Good Shepherd's character is that the Good Shepherd leads us and calls us by name. Look back in John 10 at verse 3, at what we looked at last week, where he says, the sheep listen to his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. So sheep tend to follow. They know a voice. Even today, people have described being in this part of the world and Bedouins with their sheep. They might come together for security or for community, and all their sheep are mixed in together. And observers have watched that in the morning when it's time to separate, that the shepherds will go to different sides of where the sheep are held and just call, and the sheep know their voice and start moving toward them. And part of how Jesus leads us is that Jesus goes ahead of us. Remember what Jesus said to his disciples. What was the call? Come, follow me. It's the same call to us, that we are following a path that Jesus has taken. We're following a path that Jesus has blazed. Jesus isn't driving us from behind, lashing us, or yelling at us, or pushing us somewhere that he was not willing to go. But when we listen to the voice of Jesus, we are following his steps. He's already been there. That's a part of his character. And then the number one distinguishing characteristic of the Good Shepherd is that he lays down his life for the sheep. He lays down his life for the sheep. That's such a beautiful picture. And this had to be such a surprising thing for the people in the audience to hear, because what we have is a preview of the cross. What we have is what's going to happen in Jesus' life, and he's telling them about it right here, that the Good Shepherd will lay down his life for the sheep. This is the contrast with the hired hand. We have so many leaders today who are not going to care for the people in their charge, but at the first sign of trouble are going to leave, abandon the ship, abandon the sheep. But instead, with the Good Shepherd, Jesus tells us he lays down his life for the sheep. That's the essential character of the Good Shepherd. And the reason that we should be willing to follow Jesus is that Jesus is the one who died for you, who went to the cross for us. So why should we follow Jesus? Because he's laid out for us this beautiful character of the Good Shepherd. The second thing this passage shows us is the mission of the Good Shepherd, is the mission of the Good Shepherd. So Jesus not only has a character that we should follow, but he has a mission for himself and for us that we are to pursue. And so in this passage, he makes this mention here. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. I think that sentence must have been a little bit confusing to people hearing that initially. Because this is all a Jewish audience here. We have the Pharisees. We have the man born blind who he had been kicked out of the synagogue. That's what sparked this whole discussion. But Jesus is pointing to his role as God's servant to lead the people. But then he mentions, I have other sheep. So what's Jesus talking about here? He's pointing to the mission to other people, to the Gentiles, which really wasn't in their kind of concept of what God was going to be up to at all. Though we talked about for 7 weeks when we went through the Great Commission and focusing on that story, that going all the way back to Abraham, this has been the plan and purpose of God in calling God's people, that the reason God formed a people was because of this mission. God said to Abraham, through you all nations of the earth will be blessed. So that's been the idea from the very beginning. And as Jesus has come, his whole life is lived right here within Israel, really within about 100 miles from Galilee down to Jerusalem. His whole life and ministry has been in this area, but he drops these hints along the way that the ultimate mission is going to be greater. And so we see that here in his comment that there are other sheep. This is the mission that Jesus is going to send us to pursue when he tells us to go to all nations. Because God's concern does not stop at the borders of Israel, and God's concern does not stop at the borders of our nation, but God's plan is for all nations to know him and honor him and worship him. And so as followers of Jesus, we are following this mission that Jesus has set before us, and that there are other sheep. Then a second part of the mission of the Good Shepherd is in drawing us into a relationship. He says, the reason my Father loves me is I lay down my life to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down on my own accord. And I have authority to lay it down, and this is the command I received from my Father. What Jesus mentions in this passage is that we are drawn into the relationship of Jesus with the Father. And this is really a beautiful thing that Jesus invites us to participate in, this incredible gift that we have of relationship with the Father and the Son. This is such a contrast to what we saw in chapter 9 with the Pharisees, because their model was to put more and more burdens of law on the people. All of the Sabbath laws, more and more are weighing them down. But the idea is that when you perform all of these laws, when you follow them perfectly, then God's approval will rest on you. And we have lots of relationships in life that are based on our performance. Some of that, even a teacher and a student, that relationship is broader than that, but a big part of it is, well, what's the grade that you get? What is your performance? Or a student and a coach. We have those kinds of relationships. You are performing. You are doing what the coach has asked you to. We have employee and employer relationships. You have the job description. You have job performance reviews. You are reward based on your performance. There's rewards with it. Client and customer and all kinds of relationships of trade where I do one thing and you do something in return. But what Jesus is saying in this passage is that we aren't drawn into that kind of relationship when the Good Shepherd draws us in, because it becomes a family relationship. He talks about his unity with the Father and how that relationship is shared with us. And so it's much more like that relationship of a wonderful friendship, where it's not based on what I am doing for you or what you are doing for me, but you know each other and you trust each other. When a new baby is born in the household, you don't look at it and say, well, what are you going to do for me? Here are your performance targets that you need to be hitting. There is this relationship of unconditional love. That's what Jesus draws us into. That's a part of the mission of the Good Shepherd, is to invite you and me into this beautiful relationship of love and acceptance with the Father. That's an incredible thing. So who is it that we follow in life? There's a lot of people that we can follow that will disappoint or lead us astray. But Jesus is the one as the good shepherd who is able to meet our deepest need. This passage, I think, another echo from the Old Testament is in maybe the most important passage for understanding who Jesus is and what he would come to do, and that was Isaiah 53, the passage about the suffering servant. And in that passage, it describes us as sheep. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. But that passage gives the beautiful picture of him bearing our transgressions. By his stripes, we are healed. So who do we follow in life? Truly, we all go astray. Every single one of us. Maybe if you're honest with your life, you are very astray right now. That you're making choices that are taking you far from God's will, that you're making choices that are destructive and hurtful to you and the people around you, and maybe you feel totally stuck, and you don't know what to do. But the good news is that the Good Shepherd is calling you. And what the Bible is so clear about is that all we really need to do is to repent of our sins and to follow him. He's calling us to follow him. And in him we find forgiveness. And in him we find peace. And in him we find hope. And in him we find wholeness. So who is it that you follow? That's the most important question in life. Thank you for listening today to the First Baptist Shreveport podcast. You can learn more about our church and watch the services at firstbaptistshreveport.org.